There's a pattern in history that has toppled three major governments in the last 250 years. And right now, in 2025, the United States is following that exact same pattern, stage by stage, grievance by grievance, almost like we're reading from a script written in blood and chaos. In 1789, France was the most powerful nation in Europe, wealthy, cultured, advanced, and within 5 years, the government was overthrown. The king was beheaded, and the country descended into the terror, where 40,000 people were executed for political crimes.
In 1917, Russia was a vast empire. The Tsar ruled 180 million people. The military had just fought in World War I, and in 8 months, the entire regime collapsed. The Tsar was executed. The Bolsheviks took power, and 20 million would die in the civil war and purges that followed. In 1959, Cuba was a prosperous Caribbean nation. American tourists, casinos, a functioning economy, and in 2 years, Fidel Castro overthrew the government, nationalized everything, and turned the country into a communist dictatorship that lasted 60 years.
3 times. 3 revolutions. 3 moments when a seemingly stable government collapsed into chaos. And every time, the people in power never saw it coming. They thought they were untouchable. They thought the peasants would never rise. They thought the system was too strong to fall. They were wrong every single time. And right now, every warning sign that preceded those 3 revolutions is present in the United States. The wealth inequality, the government corruption, the loss of faith in institutions, the rage building beneath the surface. We're not heading toward the pattern, we're in stage 4. And history says stage 5 and 6 come next.
This is the story of how revolutions happen, why governments never see them coming, and why the math says we're next. Understanding revolution. Before we go through the pattern, you need to understand what a revolution actually is. Not a protest, not a riot, not political change. A revolution is when the existing order is completely destroyed and replaced with something new, often something worse. Revolutions don't happen because people are poor. Poverty has existed for all of human history. Revolutions happen when expectations exceed reality, when people believe they deserve better than what they have, when the gap between the elites and everyone else becomes so extreme that the social contract breaks.
And most importantly, when people lose faith that the system can fix itself, that the government, the courts, the elections, any of it will address their grievances, when peaceful reform becomes impossible, violent revolution becomes inevitable. That's not radical theory, that's John F. Kennedy's exact words. Those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable. And history proves it every single time. France, Russia, Cuba, 3 different centuries, 3 different ideologies, but the exact same 6-stage sequence. Let's look at how it actually played out.
France, 1789, the mother of all modern revolutions. In the 1780s, France was the center of European civilization. Paris was the cultural capital of the world. French was the language of diplomacy, the arts, philosophy, science, all flourishing. King Louis XVI sat on the throne. The monarchy had ruled France for 800 years. It seemed eternal, unshakable. But beneath the surface, the rot was total. Stage 1. Extreme wealth inequality. In 1789, France had 27 million people divided into 3 estates. The first estate, the clergy, owned 10% of the land and paid no taxes. The second estate, the nobility, about 400,000 people, owned 25% of the land and paid almost no taxes. The third estate, everyone else, 26 million peasants, workers, and middle class, owned 65% of the land and paid all the taxes.
Let that sink in. 1.5% of the population paid no taxes, while 98.5% carried the entire burden. And it wasn't just taxes. The nobility had privileges. They could hunt on peasant land. They could demand labor.
They lived in palaces while peasants starved. By 1788, a bad harvest caused bread prices to spike. Bread was 88% of a peasant's budget. When prices doubled, people couldn't eat. But the nobility, still eating five-course meals, still throwing lavish parties at Versailles. The gap between the rich and everyone else wasn't just economic, it was a complete disconnect from reality.
Stage 2. Government corruption and incompetence. King Louis XVI was not evil. He was weak and indecisive. France was bankrupt from fighting wars, including helping America in the Revolutionary War. The government owed billions, and Louis' solution? Borrow more, raise taxes on the peasants, cut nothing. The nobility refused to pay taxes. The clergy refused. And when Louis tried to reform, they blocked him, because the people with power would rather see the country burn than give up their privileges. Sound familiar? By 1789, France was in crisis. The government couldn't pay its debts. The people couldn't afford food. And Louis called the Estates General, a representative assembly that hadn't met in 175 years. He thought it would legitimize new taxes. Instead, it became the spark.
Stage 3. Middle class, destroyed, and radicalized. The Third Estate, which included not just peasants but also lawyers, merchants, and educated middle class, demanded equal representation. They wanted one vote per person, not one vote per estate, which gave the nobility and clergy a 2-to-1 advantage. Louis refused. So on June 17th, 1789, the Third Estate declared itself the National Assembly. They locked themselves in a tennis court and vowed not to leave until France had a constitution. This is the moment when the middle class, the educated people who should be supporting the system, turn against it. When lawyers and merchants say the government is illegitimate, that's when revolution becomes inevitable.
July 14th, 1789, Parisians stormed the Bastille prison, a symbol of royal authority. They killed the guards, paraded their heads on pikes through the streets. The revolution had begun, and it escalated fast. Stage 4. Loss of faith in institutions. The monarchy, the church, the courts all lost legitimacy. The National Assembly abolished feudalism, seized church lands, declared the rights of man. But it wasn't enough. The radicals kept pushing.
Stage 5. Revolutionary movement gains mass support. The Jacobins, led by Robespierre, demanded more extreme measures. They wanted to execute the king, redistribute all wealth, purge the enemies of the revolution, and they gained popular support because the moderates had failed to deliver. The economy was still in crisis, food was still scarce, and people wanted blood. January 21st, 1793. King Louis XVI was beheaded by guillotine in public. His wife, Marie Antoinette, followed in October, and then the terror began.
Stage 6. Government overthrown, chaos follows. From 1793 to 1794, the Committee of Public Safety led by Robespierre executed 40,000 people. Nobles, priests, political opponents, even fellow revolutionaries who weren't radical enough. They called it purifying the revolution. It was mass murder. The guillotine ran daily in Paris, public executions as entertainment. And the purge kept expanding. First the nobility, then the moderate revolutionaries, then anyone accused of counter-revolutionary thoughts. No trial, no evidence, just accusation and death. Robespierre himself was eventually executed by the same system he created, because revolutions devour their own children, always.
By 1799, France was exhausted. 10 years of chaos, economic collapse, war on all fronts, and Napoleon seized power in a coup, became emperor. The revolution that began with liberty, equality, fraternity ended with a military dictatorship that would drag Europe into 15 years of war. The lesson of France? Extreme inequality plus government incompetence plus loss of faith in institutions leads to revolution. And revolution leads to chaos, terror, and often dictatorship, worse than what came before.
Russia, 1917, the empire that fell in months. By 1917, Russia was a backwards empire ruled by Tsar Nicholas II. The Romanov dynasty had ruled for 300 years, and Russia was massive, 180 million people spanning from Europe to the Pacific. But beneath the imperial facade, the same rot. Stage 1. Extreme wealth inequality. The Tsar and nobility owned everything. The peasants, 80% of the population, owned nothing. They'd been freed from serfdom in 1861, but most still worked land owned by nobles, paying rent they couldn't afford. In the cities, factory workers labored 12, 14 hours a day for starvation wages. Child labor was common. Safety regulations didn't exist.
Meanwhile, the Tsar lived in palaces. The nobility hosted balls that cost more than a peasant would earn in a lifetime. The gap wasn't just economic. It was feudal, medieval, and unsustainable. Stage 2. Government corruption and incompetence. Tsar Nicholas II was a disaster, weak, indecisive, and completely out of touch with reality. He believed in divine right, that God had chosen him to rule, and therefore no reform was necessary. When workers peacefully marched to the Winter Palace in 1905 to petition for better conditions, his guards opened fire. Hundreds killed. Bloody Sunday. It destroyed any remaining faith that the Tsar cared about his people. Then came World War I. Russia entered in 1914, and it was a catastrophe. Millions of poorly equipped soldiers sent to die. Officers were incompetent. Supply lines collapsed. Soldiers fought without bullets. Entire divisions surrendered because they had no ammunition. By 1917, Russia had suffered 3 million casualties. The army was deserting. The economy was collapsing. And the Tsar, still living in luxury, still making decisions based on advice from Rasputin, a mystical holy man who had influence over the Tsarina.
February 1917, bread riots in Petrograd, St. Petersburg. Women in bread lines started protesting. Workers joined them. The army was called in to restore order, but the soldiers refused to fire on the crowds. They mutinied. Stage 3. Middle class and military turn against the government. When the army won't defend you, the government is over. The Duma, Russia's parliament, demanded Nicholas abdicate, and on March 15, 1917, he did. After 300 years, the Romanov dynasty ended not with a war, but with a whimper.
A provisional government took over, led by Alexander Kerensky. They promised reforms, elections, a constitution, but they made a fatal mistake. They kept Russia in World War I. The soldiers wanted peace, the people wanted food, and the provisional government delivered neither. Stage 4. Loss of faith in institutions. The provisional government lost legitimacy within months. They were seen as weak, incompetent, beholden to foreign powers. And into that vacuum stepped Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks.
Stage 5. Revolutionary movement gains mass support. Lenin promised 3 things: peace, land, bread. End the war. Redistribute the nobility's land to peasants. Feed the people. Simple, direct. And the Bolsheviks built a disciplined revolutionary organization ready to seize power. October 25, 1917, the Bolsheviks launched a coup. They stormed the Winter Palace, arrested the provisional government, and Lenin declared Soviet power. The whole operation took less than 24 hours, almost bloodless, but what followed wasn't.
Stage 6. Government overthrown, chaos follows. The Russian Civil War lasted from 1918 to 1922. The Reds, Bolsheviks, versus the Whites, everyone else, monarchists, liberals, foreign intervention. It was total war. And the Bolsheviks won through ruthless terror. The Cheka, the secret police, executed anyone suspected of counter-revolutionary activity. Entire villages wiped out.
In July 1918, the Tsar and his entire family were executed in a basement, shot and bayoneted, even the children.
By 1922, the Bolsheviks controlled Russia, but the cost was catastrophic. 10 million dead in the Civil War. Famine killed millions more. The economy was destroyed. In Lenin's promises, peace meant surrender to Germany in humiliating terms. Land meant collectivization and famine. Bread meant rationing and starvation. The revolution that promised liberation delivered dictatorship. Stalin would take over in 1924 and killed 20 million more in purges and famines. The lesson of Russia? When government incompetence meets military defeat meets revolutionary organization, the entire system can collapse in months, and what replaces it is often far worse.
Cuba in 1959, the most recent example. This one is different because Cuba wasn't a backwards peasant society. It was a relatively prosperous country in the 1950s. Cuba had one of the highest standards of living in Latin America. Havana was called the Monte Carlo of the Caribbean. Tourism, casinos, American investment. But beneath the glamour, the same pattern. Stage 1, extreme wealth inequality. The wealth was concentrated in Havana and among elites connected to President Fulgencio Batista's regime. The rural poor, especially in eastern Cuba, lived in poverty. Sugar plantations dominated the economy. American companies owned much of the land. The profits flowed out of the country or into the pockets of a small elite.
Meanwhile, rural Cubans had no health care, no education, no opportunity. The gap between Havana's nightclubs and the rural countryside was enormous. Stage 2, government corruption and incompetence. Batista was a dictator who seized power in a 1952 coup. He canceled elections, ruled by decree, and the corruption was total. Police could be bought. Courts were rigged. Political opponents were imprisoned or killed. American mobsters ran the casinos with Batista's blessing, paying him a cut.
The government existed to enrich Batista and his cronies, nothing else. And when people protested, the response was violence, secret police, torture, disappearances. This created rage, especially among young, educated Cubans who saw their country being looted. Stage 3, middle class radicalized. Fidel Castro was a lawyer from a relatively wealthy family, educated. He could have been part of the elite, but he saw the corruption and chose revolution. In 1953, he led an attack on the Moncada barracks. It failed. He was imprisoned. But at his trial, he gave a speech that would inspire thousands. "History will absolve me," he said. He was released in an amnesty in 1955 and went to Mexico to plan. December 1956, Castro returned with 82 men on a boat called Granma. They landed in eastern Cuba. Batista's forces ambushed them. Only 20 survived and escaped to the Sierra Maestra Mountains. Most revolutionaries would have given up. Castro didn't. This is where the pattern accelerates. Stage 4, loss of faith in institutions. Batista's brutality turned the population against him. When the army razed villages suspected of helping rebels, they created more rebels. When police tortured students, their classmates joined the revolution. Castro's forces grew not because of ideology, because Batista was hated.
And the United States, which had supported Batista, started backing away. When your foreign patron abandons you, you're finished. Stage 5. Revolutionary movement gains mass support. By 1958, Castro had thousands of fighters, urban resistance cells in every city, support from peasants who saw him as their defender, and Batista's army was collapsing. Soldiers deserted. Officers fled with stolen money. On January 1st, 1959, Batista fled to the Dominican Republic with $300 million. Castro entered Havana on January 8th, victorious. Stage 6. Government overthrown, chaos follows.
At first, Castro promised democracy, elections, free press. But within months, the mask dropped. Political opponents were arrested, trials and executions. The press was censored, and Cuba became a communist dictatorship. Castro nationalized everything: factories, farms, businesses. Anyone who resisted was imprisoned or executed. Hundreds were shot in the first year. Thousands fled. The middle class that had supported Castro because they hated Batista, they learned too late that revolution doesn't bring freedom. It brings new tyrants.
Cuba remained a dictatorship for 60 years. Fidel ruled until 2008. His brother Raúl until 2018. The revolution that promised liberation delivered poverty and repression. The lesson of Cuba? Even in a relatively developed country, corruption and brutality can trigger revolution, and the revolutionaries once in power become the new oppressors.
Stage 1. Extreme wealth inequality. In all three cases, wealth was concentrated in a tiny elite while the masses struggled. France, nobility and clergy paid no taxes. Russia, czar and nobles owned everything. Cuba, Batista and connected elites looted the country. The specific numbers varied, but the pattern is the same. When the top 1% control 25 to 40% of wealth, when the gap between rich and poor becomes visible and insulting, resentment builds. This alone doesn't cause revolution. Inequality has always existed, but it's the foundation. Check. Stage 2. Government corruption and incompetence. In all three cases, the government was seen as illegitimate. France, Louis XVI couldn't reform and kept borrowing. Russia, Nicholas II was incompetent and disconnected from reality. Cuba, Batista was a corrupt dictator. When government exists only to serve elites, when corruption is obvious, when incompetence leads to crisis, people lose respect for authority. Check.
Stage 3. Middle class destroyed and radicalized. This is the key stage. Revolutions don't start with the poorest. They start when the educated middle class loses hope in the system. France, lawyers and merchants led the National Assembly. Russia, students and intellectuals joined the Bolsheviks. Cuba, Castro was a lawyer. His supporters were educated urbanites. When the people who should benefit from stability turn against it, revolution becomes likely. Check. Stage 4. Loss of faith in institutions. When people stop believing in elections, courts, police, the social contract is broken. France, the Estates General became a revolutionary assembly. Russia, soldiers refused to defend the Tsar. Cuba, everyone knew Batista rigged elections. When institutions lose legitimacy, when people believe the system cannot be reformed from within, they look for alternatives outside the system. This is the point of no return. Check.
Stage 5. Revolutionary movement gains mass support. This is when organized groups offer an alternative. France, the Jacobins. Russia, the Bolsheviks. Cuba, Castro's 26th of July movement. They promise justice. They promise to punish the corrupt. They promise a better future. And people desperate for change support them, not because they love the revolutionaries, because they hate the current government more. Check. Stage 6. Government overthrown, chaos follows. This is the culmination. The old order collapses. France, king beheaded, terror follows. Russia, czar executed, civil war kills millions. Cuba, Batista flees, Castro becomes dictator. And here's the pattern within the pattern. The revolution never delivers what it promises. It delivers blood, purges, and new tyranny. Because revolutions are led by extremists, and extremists don't build, they destroy. The moderates who wanted reform, executed or exiled. The people who thought revolution would bring freedom, they learned too late that chaos is worse than corruption.
The United States in 2025. Now, let's talk about the United States in 2025 and why every warning sign is flashing red. Stage 1. Extreme wealth inequality. Check. In 1980, the top 1% in America controlled 8% of wealth. Today, it's 32%, higher than France in 1789. The top 0.1%, about 130,000 households, own more wealth than the bottom 90%, about 117 million households. The gap between billionaires and everyone else is larger than any time in American history, larger than the Gilded Age, larger than the 1920s. The rich are visible: private jets, mega yachts, space tourism, while the middle class can't afford homes, healthcare, or education. While millions work multiple jobs just to survive, the rage is building, and it's justified.
Stage 2. Government corruption and incompetence. Check. Trust in Congress is at 15%. Trust in the Supreme Court is collapsing. Half the country believes elections are rigged. Insider trading by members of Congress is rampant. Lobbyists write legislation. Corporations own politicians, and nothing gets done. Infrastructure is crumbling. The debt is $36 trillion and climbing. Problems that should be solved aren't because government doesn't serve the people. It serves donors. When both parties are seen as corrupt and incompetent, when voters believe the system is rigged, faith in democracy dies.
Stage 3. Middle class destroyed and radicalized. Check. The American middle class is being hollowed out. College is unaffordable. Housing is unaffordable. Healthcare costs are bankrupting families. Wage growth is stagnant while asset prices explode. And young people, educated young people, can't achieve what their parents had. They're drowning in student debt, can't buy homes, can't start families, and they're angry. When lawyers, teachers, engineers, the people who should be succeeding, are failing, they radicalize. They look for someone to blame, and they find targets: the elites, the billionaires, the system. This is how revolutions start, not with the poorest, but with the educated who expected better.
Stage 4. Loss of faith in institutions. Check. We're here right now. Trust in media is at all-time lows. Trust in police has collapsed. Trust in elections is broken. Half the country believes the 2020 election was stolen. The other half believes the January 6th riot was a coup attempt. Neither side trusts the other. Neither side believes the institutions are legitimate. The courts are seen as political. The FBI is seen as political. Everything is seen through partisan lenses. And when that happens, when people stop believing in shared institutions, the country is no longer united. It's two nations occupying the same territory, waiting for a spark. France had the Estates General. Russia had Bloody Sunday. Cuba had Batista's brutality. America, it could be anything. A contested election, an economic crash, a political assassination, a police incident that goes viral. The kindling is dry. We're just waiting for the match. We're in stage 4, and history says stage 5 comes next. Stage 5, revolutionary movement gains mass support. This hasn't happened yet, not fully, but the pieces are forming. On the left, there's growing support for socialist policies, wealth redistribution, eat the rich rhetoric. On the right, there's growing support for authoritarianism, strongman leaders, extra-legal measures. Both sides increasingly believe the system is broken beyond reform, that it needs to be torn down and rebuilt.
When the moderates lose control, when the extremes gain mass support, stage 5 is here, and we're closer than most people realize. Stage 6, what no one wants to think about. Stage 6 is chaos. In France, 40,000 executed in the terror. In Russia, 10 million dead in civil war. In Cuba, dictatorship for 60 years. American exceptionalism says it can't happen here. We're too stable, too wealthy, too democratic. That's what they said in France. Russia was an empire that had lasted 300 years. Cuba was prosperous and modern, and all three collapsed. The pattern doesn't care about exceptionalism.
So what would stage 6 look like in America? No one knows exactly, but history gives us clues.
Political violence escalates, not riots, organized violence, assassinations, insurgency. The military and police fracture. Some units side with the government, others with the revolutionaries. Supply chains break down. Food shortages, fuel shortages. The economy collapses because no one trusts anything. States try to secede or refuse to recognize federal authority, and foreign powers interfere. China, Russia, they'd love to see America burn. The chaos could last years. Millions could die. And what emerges on the other side won't be the America we knew. It could be authoritarian. It could be fractured into regions. It could be something worse. That's stage 6. And the pattern says once you're in stage 4, it's very difficult to stop.
Conclusion. 3 revolutions, 3 identical patterns. France, Russia, Cuba. Each time the elites never saw it coming. Each time they thought they were safe. Each time they thought the peasants would never rise. And each time, the gap between rich and poor, the government corruption, the loss of faith, it all combined into an explosion that destroyed the existing order. The United States is in stage 4. The wealth gap is worse than France in 1789. The government is as dysfunctional as Russia in 1917. The faith in institutions is as broken as Cuba in 1958. And the pattern says stage 5 and 6 are coming.
Maybe we can stop it. Maybe we can reform before revolution. Maybe the system can fix itself. But the pattern says otherwise. The history says otherwise. And the warning signs are everywhere. 3 times it happened. Each time they thought they were different. Each time the pattern won. If this opened your eyes to where we actually are in the cycle, when stage 5 begins, when the revolutionary movements gain mass support, you'll want to understand what's happening and why. The answers aren't hiding in the future. They're written in the past.